Maria Santos had always believed in the power of small kindnesses. At 28, she worked as a civilian contractor at Fort Brennan, managing the officers' dining facility with the same care she once brought to her grandmother's restaurant back in El Paso. Every morning at precisely 0630 hours, she arrived at the base, her dark hair neatly pulled back, her uniform pressed and spotless. The dining hall buzzed with the familiar sounds of military life, the clink of silverware against ceramic plates, the low murmur of conversations about training exercises and deployment schedules, and the occasional burst of laughter from a table of young lieutenants. Maria moved through this world like a gentle current, refilling coffee cups, ensuring the breakfast service ran smoothly, and greeting each officer with a warm smile that seemed to brighten even the most exhausted faces. Colonel James Morrison had been coming to the dining facility every morning for 3 years. Tall and broad-shouldered, with graying temples that gave him a distinguished air, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had served his country for over 2 decades. His uniform bore the ribbons and badges of someone who had seen combat, made difficult decisions, and earned the respect of his subordinates through action rather than rank alone. Maria noticed things about people that others missed. She observed that Colonel Morrison always sat at the same table by the window, always ordered his eggs over easy with wheat toast, and always drank his coffee black. She noticed that he read the morning briefings while he ate, occasionally making notes in the margins with a silver pen that looked expensive. Most importantly, she noticed that he treated everyone around him with respect, from the newest private to the kitchen staff who prepared his meals. What Maria didn't know, as she poured his coffee on this particular Tuesday morning in October, was that Colonel Morrison's life was about to change forever. She couldn't see the weight of the secret he carried, or understand the complexity of the situation that would soon engulf them both. All she saw was a man who appreciated good service and always said thank you. The coffee she served was from a special blend that the facility had started carrying just last month. It came from a small roastery in Colombia, chosen because several officers had requested something better than the standard military-issue brew. Maria took pride in these small improvements to the dining experience. She had convinced her supervisor to try the new supplier, arguing that good coffee could improve morale just as much as good food. As she filled Colonel Morrison's cup, she noticed he seemed more tired than usual. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his shoulders carried a tension she hadn't seen before. Without thinking, she lingered for a moment longer than necessary, ensuring his cup was perfectly filled, and gave him one of her genuine smiles. "Good morning, Colonel. Is everything all right with your breakfast today?" He looked up from his briefing papers, and, for a moment, something vulnerable flickered across his features before his military composure reasserted itself. "Everything's perfect, Maria. Thank you for asking." She nodded and moved on to the next table, unaware that this brief exchange had provided Colonel Morrison with the first moment of genuine human warmth he had experienced in weeks. The pressure of his current assignment had isolated him from normal social connections, and Maria's simple kindness felt like a lifeline. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in Washington, D.C., a different kind of morning was beginning. In a nondescript government building, senior investigator Rebecca Chun was reviewing a file that had landed on her desk the previous evening. The Department of Defense Inspector General's office had received an anonymous tip about irregularities in military contracts, specifically mentioning Fort Brennan and several high-ranking officers. Rebecca had built her career on attention to detail and an almost supernatural ability to see patterns where others saw only chaos. At 35, she had investigated corruption cases that had brought down generals, exposed fraud schemes worth millions of dollars, and earned a reputation as someone who never gave up once she caught the scent of wrongdoing. The tip mentioned unusual financial activity, contracts awarded without proper competitive bidding, and the potential involvement of officers at the colonel level or higher. What made this case particularly interesting was the specificity of the information provided. Someone with inside knowledge had compiled detailed records of contract numbers, dates, and monetary amounts. This wasn't the work of a disgruntled subordinate making vague accusations. This was someone with access to sensitive information who wanted to see justice done. Rebecca pulled up the background files on Fort Brennan's senior staff. Colonel Morrison's record was exemplary. Combat deployments, leadership commendations, and a reputation for integrity that had earned him rapid promotion through the ranks. His financial disclosure forms showed modest savings, a mortgage on a house in base housing, and no unusual assets or investments. On paper, he looked like exactly what the military needed in its leadership. But Rebecca had learned long ago that paper could lie. People were complex, and even the most decorated officers could find themselves in situations that compromised their judgment. Financial pressure, family problems, blackmail, or simple greed had brought down many careers that had started with promise and honor. Back at Fort Brennan, Colonel Morrison was struggling with a decision that seemed to have no good options. 6 months earlier, he had discovered evidence that his immediate supervisor, General Patricia Hawthorne, was involved in a contract manipulation scheme. The evidence was solid: communications with defense contractors, altered bidding documents, and bank records that showed suspicious financial transactions. The dilemma was complicated by the fact that General Hawthorne had been his mentor for years. She had recommended him for promotion, supported his career when others doubted his potential, and treated him like a son. More importantly, she was scheduled to testify before Congress next month about the military's efforts to reduce waste and improve accountability. Her testimony could influence billions of dollars in future defense spending and affect the careers of hundreds of officers. If Morrison reported what he had discovered, it would destroy Hawthorne's career and potentially damage the military's relationship with Congress at a critical time. If he remained silent, he would be complicit in corruption and betraying his oath as an officer. Either choice felt like a betrayal of something he valued. The weight of this decision had been affecting his sleep, his appetite, and his ability to focus on his normal duties. His staff had noticed the change in his demeanor, though none dared to ask directly about it. Military culture discouraged subordinates from questioning their superiors' personal struggles, even when those struggles were obvious. Maria had noticed too, though she understood it differently. In her experience, men who carried responsibility often showed stress in small ways. The set of their shoulders, the way they held their coffee cup, the brief moments when their professional mask slipped. Her grandfather had been a foreman at a construction company, and she remembered seeing the same expression on his face when he worried about meeting deadlines or keeping his workers employed. As she cleaned tables and prepared for the lunch service, Maria found herself thinking about Colonel Morrison's tired eyes. She had grown up in a household where taking care of others was considered both a duty and a privilege. Her grandmother had run a small restaurant that served the working families of their neighborhood, and Maria had learned that food and kindness could provide comfort that went beyond simple nutrition. The lunch crowd brought its own energy to the dining facility. Younger officers discussed training exercises with enthusiasm, while senior staff huddled over laptops and spoke in the abbreviated language of military planning. Maria moved through the controlled chaos with practiced efficiency, but she found herself watching for Colonel Morrison's return. He arrived later than usual, looking even more worn than he had that morning. His usual table was occupied, so he sat at a smaller table near the kitchen entrance. This placed him directly in Maria's path as she carried trays and managed the service flow. She noticed that he barely touched his lunch, instead staring at his phone as if waiting for a message that might change everything. Without consciously deciding to do so, Maria found reasons to pass by his table more frequently. She refilled his water glass, ensured his silverware was properly arranged, and eventually brought him a fresh cup of coffee without being asked. Each small service was performed with the same professional efficiency she brought to every interaction, but there was an extra measure of attentiveness that came from genuine concern. Colonel Morrison noticed, and for reasons he couldn't entirely explain, these small gestures provided a comfort that nothing else had offered in weeks. There was something pure about Maria's kindness, unmarked by the complexity and compromise that defined so much of his professional world. In her presence, he could almost remember what it felt like to be simply human rather than a collection of rank insignia and responsibilities. What neither of them realized was that their interactions were being observed with keen interest by Staff Sergeant William Torres, General Hawthorne's aide-de-camp. Torres had been assigned to keep careful track of Colonel Morrison's activities, though he had been told this was for security reasons rather than surveillance. His job was to file daily reports about Morrison's meetings, communications, and general behavior. Torres was a career soldier who had built his reputation on loyalty and discretion. He followed orders without question and prided himself on his ability to notice details that others missed. In his reports, he noted Morrison's unusual demeanor, his decreased appetite, and his tendency to spend longer than necessary at meals. He also noted the dining facility staff member who seemed to pay particular attention to the colonel's needs. These observations were compiled into reports that found their way to General Hawthorne's desk each evening. She read them with growing concern, not because she suspected Morrison of any wrongdoing, but because she recognized the signs of someone struggling with a difficult decision. Her years of leadership had taught her to read people, and Morrison's behavior suggested he was carrying a burden that was affecting his performance. What she didn't know was that the burden was knowledge of her own corruption. In her mind, Morrison was simply dealing with the stress of his position, perhaps struggling with personal issues that he was too proud to discuss. She considered calling him in for a private conversation, offering support, or perhaps recommending counseling services that were available to military personnel. Meanwhile, Rebecca Chun was making progress on her investigation from her office in Washington. She had requested financial records from several defense contractors and was beginning to see patterns that suggested systematic manipulation of the bidding process. The contracts in question involved food service, facility maintenance, and equipment procurement, all areas where inflated prices could be hidden within legitimate operational expenses. One name kept appearing in the documentation: General Patricia Hawthorne. As the commanding officer responsible for base operations at Fort Brennan, her signature appeared on approval forms for contracts worth millions of dollars. More significantly, several of the winning contractors had made substantial charitable contributions to organizations that Hawthorne supported, creating a potential connection between favorable contract decisions and financial benefit. Rebecca knew that proving corruption required more than suspicious coincidences. She needed evidence of direct communication between Hawthorne and the contractors, proof of quid pro quo arrangements, or testimony from someone with first-hand knowledge of wrongdoing. The anonymous tip had provided a roadmap, but building a case would require careful investigation and potentially turning someone on the inside. As she reviewed the personnel files of officers at Fort Brennan, Colonel Morrison's record stood out for several reasons. His position gave him access to contract approval processes. His reputation for integrity made him an unlikely willing participant in corruption, and his recent behavior suggested he might be struggling with knowledge of wrongdoing. If Morrison had discovered evidence of corruption, he might be willing to cooperate with an investigation if approached correctly. Rebecca began planning a trip to Fort Brennan, using the cover of a routine compliance audit to avoid alerting potential targets of the investigation. She would need to be careful in her approach, since premature disclosure could allow evidence to be destroyed and witnesses to be intimidated. The key would be identifying the right person to approach first, someone who could provide insight into the internal dynamics at the base. Back in the dining facility, Maria was beginning her evening cleanup routine. The dinner service had been quiet, with most officers eating quickly and returning to their duties. Colonel Morrison had not appeared for dinner, which was unusual for him. Maria found herself wondering if he was ill, or if the stress she had observed was affecting his appetite. As she wiped down tables and prepared the facility for the next day, Maria reflected on the strange satisfaction she found in this work. Growing up, she had dreamed of becoming a teacher, but financial circumstances had led her to take this job instead. What she had discovered was that caring for people could take many forms, and that small acts of service could be just as meaningful as grand gestures. She thought about Colonel Morrison's tired eyes and made a mental note to ensure his favorite coffee blend was fully stocked for the next day. It was a small thing, but in her experience, small things often mattered most when someone was struggling. She had no way of knowing that her simple kindness was providing emotional support for a man wrestling with one of the most difficult decisions of his career. The evening air at Fort Brennan carried the sounds of routine military life, the distant noise of training exercises, the measured steps of security patrols, and the low hum of administrative buildings where officers worked late into the night. In his office, Colonel Morrison stared at a secure computer screen displaying the evidence he had compiled against General Hawthorne. The documents told a clear story of corruption, but they also represented the end of relationships and trust that had defined his career. Making the decision to report what he had discovered would require a courage different from anything he had shown in combat. In war, enemies were clearly defined, and moral choices were usually obvious. This situation offered only shades of gray and consequences that would ripple through many lives. As he prepared to leave his office for another sleepless night, Colonel Morrison found himself thinking about Maria's smile and the simple comfort of her kindness. In a world that seemed increasingly complex and compromised, her genuine care for others represented something pure and good. He didn't know her story or understand why her small gestures affected him so deeply, but he was grateful for the reminder that decent people still existed in positions of service. What he couldn't imagine was that Maria Santos, a civilian contractor who served coffee and managed a dining facility, would soon hold the key to resolving the crisis that was consuming his life. The threads of their separate stories were about to become entangled in ways that neither could foresee, setting in motion events that would test their characters and change their lives forever. The morning of October 15th began like any other at Fort Brennan, but beneath the surface of routine military operations, several crucial events were converging. Maria Santos arrived at the dining facility 30 minutes early, as she always did, to ensure everything was perfectly prepared for the breakfast service. She took pride in the small details that made the difference between adequate service and genuine hospitality. As she checked the coffee station, Maria noticed something unusual. The delivery of their special Colombian blend had arrived late the previous evening, and the supplier had included an additional bag with a handwritten note attached. The note was in Spanish, which Maria could read fluently, and it contained information that would have seemed meaningless to most people, but caught her attention immediately. The note mentioned that this particular batch of coffee had been processed differently due to equipment problems at the roasting facility. What struck Maria as odd was the specific mention of contract numbers and payment schedules, information that seemed completely unrelated to coffee production. Her business sense, inherited from years of helping her grandmother manage a restaurant, told her that something wasn't right about this communication. Meanwhile, Rebecca Chun was boarding an early morning flight from Washington, D.C. to the regional airport near Fort Brennan. She had spent the previous 3 weeks building a detailed timeline of the contract irregularities, and her investigation had revealed a sophisticated scheme involving multiple defense contractors and at least 2 senior military officers. The financial trail was complex, but it showed a clear pattern of inflated contracts, kickback payments, and money laundering through seemingly legitimate business transactions. What Rebecca had discovered was that the corruption scheme used a network of small businesses as intermediaries to disguise the flow of money between contractors and military officials. One of these businesses was a coffee importing company based in Colombia, which had been receiving payments far in excess of what would be reasonable for their actual products and services. The company was being used to funnel money back to accounts controlled by the conspirators. Colonel Morrison had spent another sleepless night reviewing the evidence he had compiled. His documentation now included bank records, email communications, and witness statements that clearly implicated General Hawthorne in the contract manipulation scheme. The weight of this knowledge was affecting every aspect of his life, and he knew he could not continue to carry this burden much longer. As he prepared for another difficult day, Morrison made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of avoiding the dining facility as he had been doing recently, he would maintain his normal routine. The familiar environment and Maria's quiet kindness had become one of the few sources of comfort in his increasingly isolated existence. He needed that human connection, even if it was brief and professional. When Colonel Morrison entered the dining facility at his usual time, Maria immediately noticed that he looked worse than ever. His uniform was impeccable as always, but his face showed signs of exhaustion that went beyond simple fatigue. There was a hollowness in his eyes that spoke of someone wrestling with demons that sleep could not chase away. As she poured his coffee, Maria made a decision that would change both of their lives. Instead of her usual professional greeting, she allowed genuine concern to show in her voice. "Colonel, you look like you haven't been sleeping well. Is there anything I can do to help?" The question was simple and sincere, but it struck Colonel Morrison with unexpected force. For weeks, he had been surrounded by people who either couldn't see his distress or were too intimidated by military hierarchy to acknowledge it. Maria's straightforward offer of help was like water to a man dying of thirst. "I appreciate that, Maria. I've just been dealing with some difficult work situations. Nothing that good coffee and better company can't help." He managed a smile that was more genuine than any he had produced in weeks. Maria nodded and continued her service routine, but she remained alert to his needs throughout the breakfast period. What she didn't realize was that this conversation had been observed by Staff Sergeant Torres, who made detailed notes about the exchange in his daily report. Torres was a thorough man who took his surveillance duties seriously, but he was beginning to question the purpose of his assignment. Later that morning, as Maria was managing the transition between breakfast and lunch service, she received an unexpected visitor. A well-dressed woman in civilian clothes approached her at the coffee station and introduced herself as Rebecca Chun from the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. Rebecca's manner was professional but friendly, designed to put Maria at ease rather than intimidate her. "Ms. Santos, I'm conducting a routine compliance review of dining facility operations. Would you mind if I asked you a few questions about your suppliers and service procedures?" Maria agreed, though she felt nervous about being questioned by a government investigator. As they talked, Rebecca's questions gradually focused on the coffee supply chain, particularly the Colombian roastery that had recently become their primary supplier. When Rebecca mentioned specific contract numbers and payment schedules, Maria realized that these were the same numbers she had seen on the strange note that morning. "Actually," Maria said carefully, "I received something this morning that you might find interesting." She retrieved the note from her supervisor's office and showed it to Rebecca, explaining how unusual it seemed for a coffee supplier to include such detailed financial information with their delivery. Rebecca's experience told her immediately that this note was significant evidence. The contract numbers matched those in her investigation, and the payment schedules corresponded to periods when suspicious financial transactions had occurred. More importantly, the note suggested that someone within the supply chain was trying to communicate information about the corruption scheme. As Rebecca examined the note more carefully, she realized that it might represent an attempt by someone with knowledge of the scheme to provide evidence to investigators. The placement of this information with a coffee delivery to a military dining facility was clever, since it would eventually reach personnel who might recognize its significance or pass it along to appropriate authorities. "Ms. Santos, this information is very helpful for our investigation. Can you tell me about any military personnel who have shown particular interest in the coffee service or asked questions about your suppliers?" Maria thought carefully before answering. Her instinct was to protect the people she served, but she also understood the importance of cooperating with legitimate government investigations. "Colonel Morrison has always been appreciative of our coffee service. He's mentioned how much better the new supplier is compared to what we had before, but he's never asked specific questions about contracts or payments." Rebecca made notes about this response, though she was careful not to indicate whether Colonel Morrison was a subject of interest or simply a potential witness. Her experience in these investigations had taught her that civilian employees often had insights into military operations that the participants themselves didn't recognize as significant. Meanwhile, General Hawthorne was becoming increasingly concerned about Colonel Morrison's behavior. The reports from Staff Sergeant Torres describe a man who appeared to be under severe stress, and Hawthorne was worried that personal problems might be affecting his performance. She decided to schedule a private meeting with Morrison to offer support and determine if intervention was necessary. What General Hawthorne didn't know was that Colonel Morrison had spent the morning making copies of all the evidence he had compiled. His decision to report the corruption had crystallized overnight, and he was preparing to take his information to the appropriate authorities. The only question remaining was how to protect himself and ensure that the evidence would be properly investigated rather than buried by those with an interest in covering up the scandal. As the lunch service began, Maria found herself watching Colonel Morrison with new awareness. Rebecca Chin's questions had made her realize that the dining facility was somehow connected to a larger investigation, and that the people she served every day might be involved in serious matters that she didn't fully understand. The knowledge made her feel both protective of her regular customers and concerned about her own potential involvement in whatever was happening. Colonel Morrison arrived for lunch later than usual, and Maria could see that his stress had reached a critical level. His hands shook slightly as he reached for his coffee cup, and he seemed to be having difficulty concentrating on the meal in front of him. When she refilled his coffee, she noticed that he had been writing notes on a small pad, but he quickly covered them when she approached. "Colonel," she said quietly, ensuring that no one else could hear, "I don't know what's troubling you, but I hope you know that you can trust the people who care about your well-being." Morrison looked up at her with surprise. There was something in her tone that suggested she understood more than she was saying, and her words seemed to offer both comfort and warning. For a moment, he considered the possibility that Maria might be more than just a kind dining facility manager, but her genuine concern seemed too authentic to be an act. "Thank you, Maria. That means more than you know." After Morrison left, Maria found herself analyzing their conversation and wondering if she had said too much. Rebecca Chin's visit had made her aware that she might be witnessing events that were part of a larger investigation, and she didn't want to inadvertently interfere with legitimate law enforcement activities. At the same time, her instinct to care for others made it difficult to remain completely passive when she saw someone in distress. That afternoon, Rebecca Chin was meeting with her supervisor to report on the progress of her investigation. The note that Maria had found provided a crucial link between the Colombian Coffee Company and the contract irregularities at Fort Brennan. Combined with the financial records Rebecca had obtained, it painted a clear picture of money laundering and corruption involving military procurement contracts. "The evidence is solid," Rebecca explained, "but we need someone with inside knowledge to testify about how the scheme operated. Based on the behavioral reports and his access to relevant information, Colonel Morrison might be our best option for a cooperative witness." Her supervisor nodded thoughtfully. Morrison's record suggests he's the kind of officer who would do the right thing if approached correctly. But we need to be careful about how we make contact. If he's already struggling with knowledge of corruption, a direct approach from investigators might push him to make premature disclosures that could compromise the investigation. They agreed that Rebecca would continue to build the case through documentary evidence, while looking for an opportunity to approach Morrison in a way that seemed natural rather than threatening. The key would be creating a situation where Morrison felt safe to share information without feeling like he was being cornered by investigators. Meanwhile, General Hawthorne was preparing for her scheduled meeting with Colonel Morrison. She had decided to approach the conversation as a mentor concerned about a subordinate's well-being rather than as a superior officer investigating potential problems. Her plan was to offer support and resources while gently probing to determine the cause of Morrison's obvious distress. What she couldn't anticipate was that Morrison had already made his decision to report the corruption, and that her expressions of concern would only intensify his guilt about betraying someone who had been both mentor and friend. The conversation she intended as supportive would instead become the final catalyst that drove Morrison to take decisive action. As the day progressed, Maria found herself thinking about the various conversations and events that had made this day feel different from others. Rebecca Chen's questions had opened her eyes to the possibility that her workplace was connected to serious matters involving government investigations. Colonel Morrison's obvious distress had triggered her protective instincts. The strange note with the coffee delivery had introduced an element of mystery that she didn't fully understand. Most troubling of all was the growing sense that these separate elements were somehow connected, and that she might inadvertently become involved in events beyond her control or comprehension. Her experience managing her grandmother's restaurant had taught her to read people and situations, and everything she observed suggested that important changes were coming to Fort Brennan. That evening, as Maria completed her cleaning routine and prepared to leave the dining facility, she made a decision that would prove crucial to the events that followed. Instead of simply discarding the unusual note as she normally would have with supplier communications, she made a copy for her own records. Her business training told her that unusual documentation should be preserved, even when its significance wasn't immediately apparent. As she walked to her car in the employee parking area, Maria noticed that the lights were still on in several administrative buildings. Late-night work sessions were common at military installations, but something about this evening felt different. There was an energy in the air that suggested important decisions were being made and significant events were in motion. What Maria didn't know was that in one of those lighted offices, Colonel Morrison was composing a detailed report that would expose the corruption scheme and implicate General Hawthorne in criminal activity. In another office, General Hawthorne was reviewing Torres's surveillance reports and planning a confrontation with Morrison that she hoped would resolve her concerns about his behavior. In a hotel near the base, Rebecca Chen was analyzing evidence and preparing an approach strategy that would either secure Morrison's cooperation or force her to build her case through other means. The convergence of these separate storylines would begin the next morning, when Maria's simple act of serving coffee would become the catalyst for events that none of them could predict or control. The note she had copied would prove to be crucial evidence in a federal investigation. Her kindness to Colonel Morrison would provide him with the emotional support needed to make the most difficult decision of his career, and her observations of the people around her would make her an unexpected witness to acts of courage and betrayal that would change multiple lives forever. As she drove home through the quiet streets surrounding Fort Brennan, Maria reflected on the strange satisfaction she found in taking care of others. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to serve, though she had no way of knowing that her next encounter with Colonel Morrison would set in motion a chain of events that would test her character and forever alter her understanding of duty, loyalty, and the power of simple human kindness. The morning of October 16th arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to reflect the tension building at Fort Brennan. Maria Santos arrived at the dining facility before dawn, as was her custom, but today she carried with her a sense of unease that she couldn't quite identify. The events of the previous day had left her feeling as though she was standing at the edge of something significant, though she had no clear understanding of what that might be. As she prepared the coffee station, Maria found herself thinking about the note she had copied the previous evening. Something about Rebecca Chen's questions had suggested that the financial information in that note was more important than it appeared, and Maria's instinct for detail was telling her to pay closer attention to things she might normally overlook. Colonel Morrison had barely slept. His meeting with General Hawthorne was scheduled for 0800 hours, and he knew that this conversation would likely be his last opportunity to confess his knowledge of the corruption scheme before taking formal action. The weight of betraying his mentor was almost unbearable, but his oath as an officer left him no choice but to pursue the truth regardless of personal cost. As he dressed in his service uniform, Morrison reflected on the strange comfort he had found in Maria's simple kindness over the past weeks. Her genuine concern had reminded him that there were still people in the world who acted from pure motives, without hidden agendas or competing loyalties. That reminder had strengthened his resolve to do the right thing, even when it meant destroying relationships he valued. Rebecca Chun was already at work in a temporary office she had established at a hotel near Fort Brennan. Her investigation had reached a critical phase where she needed to make contact with potential witnesses while avoiding any actions that might alert the subjects of her investigation. The note that Maria had shared the previous day had provided the missing link she needed to prove the money laundering scheme, but she still required testimony from someone with direct knowledge of how the corruption operated. Her analysis of Colonel Morrison's behavior patterns suggested that he was struggling with knowledge of wrongdoing, making him a prime candidate for cooperation. However, approaching him directly carried significant risks. If Morrison was actually involved in the corruption rather than simply aware of it, a premature contact could result in evidence being destroyed and witnesses being intimidated. Rebecca had decided to use Maria Santos as an indirect channel for making initial contact with Morrison. Civilian employees often had access to military personnel in informal settings where conversations could occur without official scrutiny. If Maria could facilitate an introduction that appeared casual rather than investigative, it might create an opportunity for Morrison to share information voluntarily. At precisely 0630 hours, Colonel Morrison entered the dining facility for what would prove to be one of the most significant breakfast services of Maria's career. She noticed immediately that his stress had reached a new level. His normally perfect military bearing showed signs of strain, and his eyes held the look of a man preparing for battle. As Maria poured his coffee, she made a decision that would change the course of events. Instead of her usual professional greeting, she spoke quietly and with unmistakable sincerity. "Colonel, I don't know what's troubling you, but I want you to know that sometimes the right thing to do is the hardest thing to do." Morrison's hand stopped halfway to his coffee cup. There was something in Maria's tone that suggested she understood more about his situation than should have been possible. For a moment, he wondered if she might be connected to the investigation he suspected was already underway, but her genuine concern seemed too authentic to be part of an official operation. "Thank you, Maria. That's exactly what I needed to hear this morning." What neither of them realized was that Staff Sergeant Torres was observing this exchange with particular interest. His surveillance reports had noted the growing familiarity between Morrison and Maria, and Torres was beginning to suspect that their relationship might be more significant than it appeared. His military training had taught him to be suspicious of any unusual patterns, and the dining facility staff members' apparent concern for Morrison's well-being struck him as potentially worth investigating. At 0800 hours, Colonel Morrison reported to General Hawthorne's office for their scheduled meeting. Hawthorne greeted him with the warmth of a mentor concerned about a valued subordinate, which only made Morrison's task more difficult. The office was decorated with mementos of Hawthorne's distinguished career, including photographs with senior government officials and citations for exceptional service. "Jim, I've been worried about you," Hawthorne began, using the informal address that emphasized their personal relationship. "Torres has been reporting that you seem to be under unusual stress. I want you to know that I'm here to help with whatever is troubling you." Morrison felt the weight of her concern like a physical blow. Here was a woman who had shaped his career, who had believed in his potential when others doubted, offering support at the very moment when he was preparing to destroy her life. The irony was almost overwhelming, but it also clarified his duty. If Hawthorne was genuinely unaware of how her actions appeared to others, then exposing the truth might actually be a kindness. "General, I need to share some information with you that I hope you can help me understand." Morrison opened his briefcase and removed a folder containing copies of the evidence he had compiled. "I've been reviewing procurement procedures as part of my normal duties, and I've discovered some irregularities that concern me." As Morrison laid out the evidence, he watched Hawthorne's expression change from concern to confusion to fear. The documents told a clear story of contract manipulation, and Hawthorne's signature appeared on many of the approval forms. More damaging were the bank records showing suspicious financial transactions that corresponded to contract award dates. "Jim, I can explain all of this, Hawthorne said, though her voice lacked conviction. Defense contracting is complex, and there are often legitimate reasons for what might appear to be irregularities. Morrison felt his heart breaking as he realized that Hawthorne was not going to confess or seek his help in resolving the situation. Instead, she was going to continue the deception, which meant that their personal relationship could not be salvaged. His duty as an officer now required him to treat her as a subject of investigation rather than a mentor and friend. General, I've prepared a complete report of these findings for submission to the appropriate authorities. I wanted to give you the opportunity to provide context or explanation before I take that step. The conversation that followed would haunt both officers for the rest of their lives. Hawthorne made increasingly desperate attempts to explain away the evidence, while Morrison maintained the professional demeanor required of his position. What should have been a moment of truth between mentor and protege became instead a formal interrogation that destroyed any possibility of preserving their personal relationship. Meanwhile, Maria was managing the lunch service while trying to process her growing sense that significant events were unfolding around her. Rebecca Chun had returned to the dining facility and was observing the daily operations with the trained eye of an investigator. Her questions the previous day had focused on suppliers and financial procedures, but today she seemed more interested in the behavior and interactions of military personnel. When Rebecca approached Maria during a quiet moment, her manner was more direct than it had been previously. "Ms. Santos, I want to be honest with you about the nature of my investigation. We're looking into serious allegations of corruption involving military contracts, and your dining facility appears to be connected to the money laundering scheme we're investigating." Maria felt a chill as she realized that her workplace was somehow involved in federal crimes. "Am I in some kind of trouble? I just manage the food service and try to take good care of the people who eat here." "You're not in trouble," Rebecca assured her. "In fact, you may have already provided crucial assistance by sharing that note yesterday. What I need to know is whether you've observed any unusual behavior or conversations among military personnel that might be related to contract approvals or financial arrangements." As Maria considered the question, she thought about Colonel Morrison's obvious distress and the conversation she had observed between various officers over the months. Military personnel often discussed operational matters while eating, and she had developed the ability to recognize when conversations involved more than routine business. "There have been some tense discussions between senior officers lately," Maria said carefully, "and Colonel Morrison has been under obvious stress for weeks. He's always been kind to me, so I've been worried about him." Rebecca made notes about this response while considering how to use Maria's relationship with Morrison to facilitate contact. If Morrison was indeed struggling with knowledge of corruption, Maria's obvious concern for his well-being might provide the emotional support he needed to cooperate with the investigation. "Maria, if Colonel Morrison seems to be in distress, it might be because he's discovered information that troubles him professionally. Sometimes good people find themselves in situations where they know about wrongdoing but aren't sure how to respond appropriately. If you have the opportunity to talk with him, you might let him know that there are people who can help him do the right thing." The suggestion was carefully phrased to avoid any appearance of coaching or manipulation, but Maria understood immediately that Rebecca was asking her to encourage Morrison to cooperate with the investigation. The request put Maria in a difficult position, since it meant using her relationship with Morrison for purposes beyond simple human kindness. At 1,400 hours, Colonel Morrison's meeting with General Hawthorne reached its conclusion. Despite her attempts to explain away the evidence, Hawthorne had been unable to provide convincing justification for the financial irregularities Morrison had discovered. More troubling was her suggestion that Morrison should consider the broader implications of his actions before making any reports that might damage the military's reputation. "Jim, you need to understand that exposing the situation will hurt a lot of innocent people. My career will be destroyed, obviously, but there will also be impacts on junior officers who had nothing to do with any irregularities. Sometimes the greater good requires us to find solutions that don't involve formal investigations." Morrison recognized this approach as an attempt to make him complicit in covering up the corruption. Hawthorne was appealing to his loyalty and his concern for others, but she was also asking him to violate his oath as an officer. The conversation clarified his understanding that Hawthorne was not an innocent victim of complex circumstances, but rather someone who had made deliberate choices to benefit personally from her position. "General, I appreciate your concern for others, but I have a duty to report what I've discovered. I hope you'll consider cooperating with the investigation to minimize the impact on innocent personnel." After leaving Hawthorne's office, Morrison felt simultaneously relieved and devastated. The confrontation he had dreaded was finally over, but it had confirmed his worst fears about someone he had trusted and admired. His next step was to prepare his formal report for submission to the appropriate authorities, but first he needed time to process the emotional impact of what had just occurred. Almost without thinking, Morrison found himself walking toward the dining facility. Maria's consistent kindness had become a source of stability during the most difficult period of his career, and he needed that human connection more than ever. As he entered the familiar space, he saw Maria preparing for the dinner service with her usual attention to detail. When she saw him approach, Maria immediately recognized that something significant had happened. The tension that had marked his behavior for weeks had been replaced by a different kind of stress, one that suggested important decisions had been made and difficult conversations had been concluded. "Colonel, you look like someone who needs a friend," she said simply, pouring him a cup of coffee without being asked. Morrison sat down at his usual table and stared at the coffee cup as if it might provide answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "Maria, what would you do if you discovered that someone you trusted had betrayed that trust in a way that harmed other people?" The question was clearly hypothetical, but Maria understood that it reflected a real situation Morrison was facing. Her response would need to provide both practical guidance and emotional support without crossing boundaries that might compromise either of their positions. "I think," she said carefully, "that when people we care about make bad choices, our job is to help them face the consequences honestly rather than protecting them from the truth. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do is refuse to enable someone's mistakes." Morrison looked up at her with surprise and gratitude. Once again, Maria had provided exactly the perspective he needed to hear. Her words confirmed his decision to report the corruption, but they also offered a framework for understanding his actions as an expression of care rather than betrayal. As the afternoon progressed, Maria found herself reflecting on the conversation and wondering about its implications. Rebecca Chin's suggestion that Morrison might need encouragement to do the right thing seemed to have been accurate, and Maria was glad she had been able to provide that support. However, she was also aware that her involvement in these events was becoming more complex than she was comfortable with. That evening, as Maria completed her usual closing routine, she noticed that Colonel Morrison remained in the dining facility long after finishing his dinner. He was writing in a notebook with the focused intensity of someone completing an important task. When he finally prepared to leave, he approached Maria with an expression of gratitude that seemed disproportionate to the simple services she had provided. "Maria, I want you to know that your kindness over these past weeks has meant more to me than you can imagine. I hope you understand that good people sometimes find themselves in situations where doing the right thing requires them to make choices that seem harsh or disloyal." Maria nodded, understanding that Morrison was preparing to take action that would have significant consequences for himself and others. "Colonel, I believe that truly caring about someone sometimes means doing things they won't thank you for, at least not at first." As Morrison left the dining facility, Maria realized that this might be the last normal conversation they would have. The investigation Rebecca Chan was conducting would soon reach a conclusion that would change everything for everyone involved. The small kindnesses that had connected her to Colonel Morrison would soon be overshadowed by events far larger than either of them could control. What Maria didn't know was that her simple words of encouragement had provided Morrison with the final emotional support he needed to submit his report to federal investigators. Within hours, her quiet dining facility would become the center of a corruption investigation that would expose fraud, destroy careers, and ultimately demonstrate that sometimes the most powerful actions are taken by people who simply refuse to remain silent when they witness wrongdoing. The threads of their separate stories had become so intertwined that neither Maria nor Morrison could predict how their choices would affect each other in the days to come. All they knew was that they had tried to do right by each other and by the principles they valued, regardless of the personal cost those choices might require. The dawn of October 17th brought with it a sense of inevitability that seemed to permeate every corner of Fort Brennan. Maria Santos arrived at the dining facility with a strange feeling that this would be a day that changed everything, though she had no specific reason for this premonition. As she began her morning preparations, she noticed several unusual vehicles in the parking area, including sedans with government plates that suggested the presence of federal investigators. Colonel Morrison had spent the night finalizing his formal report to the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. Every page represented a betrayal of personal relationships and professional loyalty, but also a fulfillment of his oath to serve with honor and integrity. As he prepared to submit the document that would destroy General Hawthorne's career and potentially his own, Morrison felt the weight of responsibility that came with making choices based on principle rather than convenience. Rebecca Chun had worked through the night, coordinating with her colleagues in Washington to prepare for the arrests and interviews that would follow Morrison's formal report. The evidence was now sufficient to support criminal charges, but the success of the prosecution would depend on obtaining detailed testimony from witnesses who understood how the corruption scheme had operated. Morrison's cooperation was essential, but it would also expose him to potential retaliation from those with interests in covering up the scandal. At precisely 0630 hours, Morrison entered the dining facility for what he knew would be his final breakfast at Fort Brennan as a normal officer going about his daily routine. Within hours, his report would trigger a federal investigation that would transform him from a concerned subordinate into a key witness in a major corruption case. The familiar comfort of Maria's morning service had become precious to him precisely because he understood how rare and fragile such simple kindnesses could be. As Maria poured his coffee, she noticed that Morrison's demeanor had changed fundamentally from the previous day. The crushing stress that had marked his behavior for weeks had been replaced by a calm resolution that suggested important decisions had been made and accepted. There was sadness in his eyes, but also a clarity that had been absent during his period of internal struggle. "Good morning, Colonel. You seem different today." Morrison smiled with genuine warmth for the first time in weeks. "I feel like I finally remembered who I'm supposed to be, Maria. Thank you for helping me find my way back to that." Neither of them spoke about the specific challenges Morrison was facing, but Maria understood that her consistent kindness had provided emotional support during a critical period in his life. The knowledge that she had helped someone navigate a difficult situation gave her deep satisfaction, even though she didn't fully understand the nature of the crisis he had been managing. At 0800 hours, Morrison submitted his formal report through secure channels to the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. The document was comprehensive and damning, providing detailed evidence of contract manipulation, money laundering, and corruption involving senior military officers. Along with the report, Morrison included copies of all supporting documentation and offered his complete cooperation with the investigation that would follow. Within 30 minutes of Morrison's submission, Rebecca Chun received authorization to begin formal interviews and evidence collection at Fort Brennan. Her first priority was securing Morrison's safety and cooperation, since his testimony would be crucial to proving the conspiracy charges against General Hawthorne and the defense contractors involved in the scheme. At 0900 hours, General Hawthorne was summoned to an emergency meeting with the base commander. She had no advance warning that Morrison had submitted his report, but the presence of federal investigators and the urgency of the summons suggested that her world was about to collapse. As she walked to the meeting, Hawthorne reflected on the choices that had led her to this moment and wondered if there might still be a way to minimize the damage to her career and reputation. Meanwhile, Maria was managing the morning service while observing the unusual activity around the base. Military personnel were moving with a focused urgency that suggested significant events were in motion, and she noticed several civilians in business attire who were clearly not part of the normal base operations. Her conversation with Rebecca Chun had prepared her to recognize the signs of a major investigation, and everything she observed suggested that the corruption case had reached a critical phase. At 1,000 hours, Rebecca Chun approached the dining facility accompanied by two other investigators. Maria recognized her immediately, but the formal nature of this visit suggested that their previous conversations had been preparation for something more serious. When Rebecca asked to speak privately, Maria agreed, though she felt nervous about her potential involvement in events she didn't fully understand. Ms. Santos, the investigation we discussed has reached a point where we need formal statements from potential witnesses. You're not suspected of any wrongdoing, but your observations and the evidence you shared may be important to our case. Would you be willing to cooperate with our investigation? Maria agreed without hesitation, though she insisted on understanding exactly what her cooperation would involve. Rebecca explained that Maria would be asked to provide testimony about her observations of military personnel, particularly any conversations or behaviors that might be related to the corruption scheme. She would also be asked to verify the authenticity of the note she had discovered and describe the circumstances under which it had been delivered. As they talked, Maria began to understand the full scope of the investigation and her inadvertent role in exposing the corruption. The simple act of sharing an unusual supplier note had provided crucial evidence in a federal case involving millions of dollars in fraudulent contracts. Her observations of Colonel Morrison's behavior had helped investigators understand the internal dynamics that had led to the exposure of the scheme. At 1,100 hours, Colonel Morrison was escorted to a secure interview room where Rebecca Chun and her colleagues were prepared to take his formal statement. Morrison had been granted immunity from prosecution in exchange for his complete cooperation, but he understood that his military career was essentially over. Officers who exposed corruption were rarely able to continue serving effectively, regardless of their legal protection. The interview lasted for 6 hours and covered every aspect of Morrison's knowledge of the corruption scheme. He provided detailed testimony about General Hawthorne's involvement, the methods used to manipulate contract awards, and the financial arrangements that had benefited the conspirators. Most importantly, he described how he had discovered the evidence and explained his decision-making process in choosing to report the corruption despite personal and professional costs. During a break in the interview, Morrison asked Rebecca about Maria's involvement in the investigation. He was concerned that her kindness to him might have inadvertently drawn her into a situation that could affect her employment or personal safety. Rebecca assured him that Maria was protected as a witness and that her cooperation was voluntary and valued by the investigation team. At 1,400 hours, General Hawthorne was formally arrested on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and money laundering. The arrest took place in her office, surrounded by the mementos of a distinguished career that was now ending in disgrace. As federal agents read her rights and placed her in custody, Hawthorne maintained the dignity that had characterized her leadership, though her world was collapsing around her. News of the arrest spread quickly through Fort Brennan, creating an atmosphere of shock and confusion among personnel who had respected Hawthorne's leadership. Many officers found it difficult to reconcile the charges against her with their personal experience of her as a mentor and role model. The cognitive dissonance created by the revelation would affect base morale for months to come. Maria learned about the arrest through the informal communication network that connected all civilian employees on the base. The news confirmed her growing understanding that the investigation Rebecca Chun had described was far more serious than she had initially realized. The dining facility she managed had somehow become connected to events that would be reported in national media and affect the careers of senior military officers. At 1,600 hours, Rebecca Chun returned to the dining facility to conduct Maria's formal interview. The session was recorded and comprehensive, covering Maria's observations of military personnel, her relationship with Colonel Morrison, and the circumstances surrounding the discovery of the supplier note. Throughout the interview, Rebecca was careful to emphasize that Maria's cooperation was appreciated and that she had performed a valuable service by reporting unusual information to investigators. As the interview concluded, Maria asked Rebecca about the likely outcomes of the investigation and her own future involvement in the case. Rebecca explained that the evidence was strong enough to support convictions, but that the legal process would require months or years to complete. Maria might be called to testify at trial, but her primary contribution to the investigation had already been made. That evening, as Maria completed her closing routine in an unusually quiet dining facility, she reflected on the extraordinary events of the day. The simple act of serving coffee and providing human kindness had somehow contributed to exposing corruption and holding powerful people accountable for their actions. The knowledge that her small gestures had made a difference in something important gave her a sense of purpose that went beyond her job description. Colonel Morrison spent the evening in temporary quarters, preparing for his departure from Fort Brennan the following day. His cooperation with the investigation had been complete and valuable, but it had also made his continued service at the base impossible. He would be reassigned pending the conclusion of the legal proceedings, and his future in the military remained uncertain. Before leaving his temporary quarters, Morrison wrote a letter to Maria expressing his gratitude for her kindness and explaining how her support had helped him make the most difficult decision of his career. He couldn't deliver the letter personally without potentially compromising the investigation, so he asked Rebecca Chan to ensure that Maria received it at an appropriate time. The letter read, "Dear Maria, I want you to know that your simple acts of kindness provided me with the strength to do the right thing during the darkest period of my life. You reminded me that there are still good people in the world who act from pure motives, and that reminder gave me the courage to honor my oath as an officer. I hope you understand that sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is the faith to believe in their better angels. Thank you for believing in mine." As the day ended, the major participants in these events were scattered across different locations, but their lives had been permanently changed by the choices they had made and the ways their paths had intersected. Maria's decision to show kindness to a troubled officer had provided emotional support that enabled him to expose corruption. Morrison's decision to report wrongdoing had fulfilled his oath as an officer and protected the integrity of military procurement processes. Rebecca's investigation had demonstrated that justice could prevail when dedicated professionals worked together to expose wrongdoing. The corruption scheme that had operated successfully for months had been brought down by a combination of professional investigation, moral courage, and simple human decency. The coffee that Maria served each morning had become the symbol of authentic human connection in an environment where personal relationships were often complicated by competing loyalties and professional obligations. As Maria drove home through the quiet streets surrounding Fort Brennan, she understood that her life had been touched by events far larger than anything she had previously experienced. The dining facility where she worked would never feel quite the same, since it had become part of a story involving federal crimes, destroyed careers, and the demonstration that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences when they chose to act with integrity and kindness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and uncertainties, but Maria felt confident that she had responded appropriately to the situation she had encountered. She had provided support to someone in need, cooperated fully with legitimate investigators, and maintained her principles throughout a complex and potentially dangerous situation. The simple act of serving coffee with genuine care had become part of a larger story about accountability, justice, and the power of individual choices to affect important outcomes. 6 months after the arrests at Fort Brennan, Maria Santos stood in a federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., preparing to testify in the corruption trial that had transformed her quiet life into something resembling a legal drama. The investigation that had begun with a simple coffee delivery and An unusual note had grown into one of the largest military procurement fraud cases in recent history, involving millions of dollars in fraudulent contracts and a conspiracy that reached into multiple defense contractors and military installations. The months since General Hawthorne's arrest had been a period of profound change for everyone involved in the case. Maria had continued managing the dining facility at Fort Brennan, but her role as a key witness in the federal investigation had given her a perspective on justice and accountability that she had never expected to possess. The media attention surrounding the case had been intense, but respectful, focusing on the systemic nature of the corruption rather than sensationalizing the personal stories of those involved. Colonel Morrison had been reassigned to a position at the Pentagon, where his expertise in procurement oversight was being used to develop new procedures designed to prevent the kind of fraud he had exposed. His cooperation with the investigation had been exemplary, and while his military career had been permanently altered by his role as a whistleblower, he had gained recognition as an officer who placed integrity above personal interests. The stress and isolation he had experienced during his internal struggle had been replaced by a sense of purpose and the respect of colleagues who admired his moral courage. Rebecca Chun had been promoted within the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, where she now supervised a team of investigators working on complex corruption cases. The success of the Fort Brennan investigation had demonstrated the importance of following seemingly minor evidence to its logical conclusion, and Rebecca's methodical approach had become a model for other investigators. Her ability to work with civilian witnesses like Maria had proved crucial to building cases that could withstand the scrutiny of federal courts. As Maria waited in the witness preparation room, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The simple act of serving coffee with genuine care had somehow connected her to events involving senior government officials, federal judges, and legal proceedings that would be studied by law students for years to come. Her grandmother's lessons about treating all people with dignity and kindness had prepared her for this role better than any formal training could have done. The prosecution team had spent weeks preparing Maria for her testimony, ensuring that she understood the legal significance of her observations and could present them clearly to a jury. However, they had been careful to emphasize that her most important contribution was simply telling the truth about what she had witnessed. The authenticity and directness that had characterized her interactions with Colonel Morrison would serve her well in the formal setting of a federal courtroom. General Hawthorne's trial had attracted national attention because it represented broader questions about accountability and integrity in military leadership. The evidence against her was overwhelming, but her defense team was arguing that she had been a scapegoat for systemic problems in defense procurement that went far beyond her individual actions. The prosecution needed to demonstrate not only that Hawthorne had committed crimes, but that she had done so deliberately and with full knowledge of the consequences. When Maria was called to testify, she entered the courtroom with the same quiet confidence that had characterized her work in the dining facility. The formal setting was intimidating, but she reminded herself that her task was fundamentally the same as it had always been, to serve others with honesty and care. The jury needed to understand what she had observed, and she was prepared to provide that service with the same attention to detail she brought to managing coffee service. Her testimony began with basic questions about her background and her role at Fort Brennan. The prosecution attorney guided her through a description of her daily responsibilities and her interactions with military personnel, establishing her credibility as someone who had regular contact with the officers involved in the case. Maria's straightforward manner and obvious sincerity made a positive impression on the jury, who could see that she was an ordinary person caught up in extraordinary circumstances. When asked about the note she had discovered with the coffee delivery, Maria described the circumstances clearly and accurately. She explained how unusual it had seemed for a supplier to include detailed financial information with a routine delivery, and how her business background had taught her to pay attention to such anomalies. The prosecution introduced the note as evidence, and Maria confirmed that it was identical to the document she had shared with Rebecca Chun. The most emotionally challenging part of Maria's testimony involved her observations of Colonel Morrison's behavior during the weeks leading up to his report. She described his obvious stress, their conversations about doing the right thing even when it was difficult, and her growing sense that he was struggling with knowledge that troubled him deeply. Throughout this testimony, Maria was careful to emphasize that Morrison had never revealed specific information about corruption, but that his distress had been obvious to anyone who cared to notice. During cross-examination, Hawthorne's defense attorney attempted to portray Maria as someone who had been manipulated by federal investigators into providing testimony that supported their predetermined conclusions. However, Maria's calm responses and obvious integrity made it difficult to challenge her credibility. When asked whether she had been coached by prosecutors, Maria replied simply that she had been prepared to tell the truth, which was all she had ever intended to do. The defense attorney pressed Maria about her relationship with Colonel Morrison, suggesting that her concern for his well-being might have colored her perceptions of his behavior. Maria acknowledged that she had cared about Morrison's obvious distress, but explained that this concern had motivated her to provide better service rather than to make assumptions about the causes of his problems. Her testimony demonstrated that civilian employees could observe military personnel with clarity precisely because they were not influenced by military hierarchy or internal politics. When asked about her decision to share the unusual note with Rebecca Chun, Maria explained that she had simply recognized that federal investigators might be better equipped to understand the significance of financial information that seemed out of place in a coffee delivery. She had not made any assumptions about what the note meant, but had trusted that appropriate authorities could determine whether it was relevant to legitimate investigations. Colonel Morrison's testimony followed Maria's, and it provided the detailed evidence needed to prove the conspiracy charges against General Hawthorne. Morrison described how he had discovered the corruption, the internal struggle he had experienced in deciding how to respond, and the process by which he had compiled evidence and submitted his formal report. His testimony was technical and comprehensive, but it was also deeply personal in its description of the emotional costs of betraying a mentor who had violated his trust. During his testimony, Morrison specifically mentioned the importance of Maria's kindness during his period of crisis. He explained that her genuine concern and encouragement had reminded him of his fundamental values and strengthened his resolve to act with integrity despite personal costs. The jury could see that Morrison's decision to report corruption had been motivated by principle rather than personal animosity, and that civilian employees like Maria had played important roles in supporting his moral courage. Rebecca Chin's testimony provided the investigative context that connected all the evidence into a coherent narrative of systematic corruption. She described how the anonymous tip had initiated the investigation, how Maria's cooperation had provided crucial evidence, and how Morrison's formal report had enabled prosecutors to build a comprehensive case against all the conspirators. Her presentation demonstrated the professional competence and dedication that had made the investigation successful. The prosecution's closing argument emphasized the importance of individual integrity in preventing and exposing corruption. They argued that General Hawthorne had violated the trust placed in her by American taxpayers and military personnel, and that her actions had undermined the integrity of defense procurement processes that were essential to national security. Most importantly, they demonstrated that the conspiracy had been exposed not by sophisticated surveillance or undercover operations, but by ordinary people who had chosen to pay attention and act on their observations. The defense's closing argument focused on the complexity of military procurement and the systemic pressures that could lead well-intentioned officers to make poor decisions. They portrayed Hawthorne as someone who had been overwhelmed by conflicting demands and inadequate oversight, rather than as a criminal who had deliberately defrauded the government. However, the evidence of deliberate deception and personal financial benefit made it difficult to sustain this argument. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all charges against General Hawthorne. The evidence had been too comprehensive and the testimony too credible to support any conclusion other than that she had engaged in deliberate corruption for personal gain. The conviction sent a message throughout the military that senior officers were not above the law and that systems existed to hold them accountable for violations of their oath. Following the trial, Maria returned to her position at Fort Brennan with a deeper understanding of her role in the broader community she served. The media attention had been overwhelming at times, but it had also brought recognition to the importance of civilian employees in maintaining the integrity of military operations. Her supervisor had supported her throughout the legal proceedings, recognizing that her cooperation with federal investigators had demonstrated the highest standards of citizenship and public service. Colonel Morrison continued his career at the Pentagon, where his experience with corruption investigations had made him a valuable resource for developing improved oversight procedures. His relationship with Maria had evolved into a professional friendship based on mutual respect and shared experience of difficult moral choices. They corresponded occasionally, sharing perspectives on integrity and service that had been shaped by their involvement in events larger than either had anticipated. The corruption case had lasting impacts on defense procurement procedures, with new oversight mechanisms designed to prevent the kind of systematic fraud that Hawthorne and her conspirators had perpetrated. The investigation had demonstrated the importance of protecting whistleblowers and encouraging all personnel, civilian and military, to report irregularities that might indicate criminal activity. For Maria, the most significant outcome was not the recognition she had received or the policy changes that had resulted from her testimony, but rather the confirmation that small acts of kindness and attention to detail could have consequences far beyond their immediate context. Her simple decision to care about Colonel Morrison's well-being and to share unusual information with investigators had contributed to exposing corruption and protecting the integrity of systems that serve the public interest. As she resumed her daily routine of serving coffee and managing the dining facility, Maria carried with her the knowledge that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences when they chose to act with integrity and courage. The coffee she poured each morning remained the same, but her understanding of its significance had been transformed by her experience of witnessing how human connections could support moral courage and enable justice. The story that had begun with a simple gesture of kindness had evolved into a complex narrative about accountability, integrity, and the power of individual choices to affect important outcomes. Maria's role in these events had demonstrated that heroes were often ordinary people who responded to extraordinary circumstances with the values they had always possessed, rather than dramatic figures who emerged from nowhere to save the day. Years later, when Maria reflected on this period of her life, she would remember not the courtroom testimony or the media attention, but rather the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had served others with integrity and compassion when it mattered most. The Colonel's coffee had become a symbol of authentic human connection in an environment where such connections could literally change the course of justice and protect the principles that democratic societies depend upon to function effectively. The simple act of serving coffee with genuine care had proved to be more powerful than anyone could have anticipated, demonstrating that the most important changes often begin with individual choices to treat others with dignity and to pay attention to the details that others might overlook. In a world where complexity and competing interests often obscured moral clarity, Maria's straightforward approach to service had provided the foundation for extraordinary outcomes that would be remembered long after the participants had moved on to other challenges and opportunities.